Dr. Aaron Adair, you wrote a book on the Star of Bethlehem. Can you tell us about that? And then we'll lead into Jesus.
I wrote a book? Geez, I forget these things. Yeah. So my first foray into like proper biblical studies was when I started really getting into the explanations for one particular story from the gospel story. And the reason I connected to it so much was that it was actually a story I learned at the Institution of Science Learning, what I was working at. I was at the Abrams Planetarium at Michigan State University. This was still a time when I was still, describe myself as Catholic deist. And in this presentation that is been a part of planetarium shows in the Americas since the 1930s, though this particular show went back to the 80s, it was a way of trying to explain the Christmas story completely in terms of describable, discoverable, calculatable scientific fact by motioning the stars, aligning it with the description from the Gospels, from historical records, and lo and behold, we can find when the Star of Bethlehem emerged on that hypothesis. And to me at that time, I was floored. I was blown away. To me, this is exactly how the creator of the universe should be doing things, that they have set things up so everything in the machine lines up perfectly when they need to. But then I discovered a problem. I went home for the holidays, and on TV they had a program also about the Star of Bethlehem, and the theory they pushed forward wasn't the same one. Okay, so how do we know which one's right? And I also realized, they're also in totally different years of when these things are going on. And then I realized, the show that we're presenting also had to literally rewrite history to change the date of the death of Herod the Great to make the theory actually work out. And that there's all this hullabaloo even trying to literally change history to make the thing historical, which should already make you stop and say, wait a minute, are we going down the right path? And then I find out there aren't two theories, there's not three theories. There seem to be about as many theories of the Star of Bethlehem as people who have written on the subject. So I decided, okay, let's dig deep and try to really figure out what's going on here. And I really started digging deep into that, after I was no longer religious, but then really getting proper into biblical studies. I had been reading and listening to stuff from Bart Ehrman and other Bible scholars. I'd listened to their stuff the great courses, and it was wow, this is really interesting stuff. We can actually scientifically examine this whole Bible thing. When I tried doing that, I got to Genesis 2, Genesis 3, got to the genealogies, snore, couldn't go on anymore, and then finding out, no, there is actually an interesting, exciting way to explore this. And so I'm okay, let's do the Bible scholar way of approaching this, and then finding out, here's how the Bible scholars explain this. Now, what about all these other scientific attempts? Do they not know about this? Not really, unfortunately. I discover more and more about the history of these ideas and realize, this was actually basically an attempt to avoid the problems that the deists were bringing up against the miracle stories. This was a last-ditch effort to try to save the biblical stories, and basically many scientists didn't get the memo on that and just thought this was, a normal scientific activity, not an old early 19th century apologetic that was well past its time. So in writing the book, I explored all the various options out there. Even before writing the book, I had actually written a scholarly article on the history of the interpretation of the Star of Bethlehem and showed how it, showed kind of the history of the interactions of science and religion. I got that published in a major peer-reviewed journal on the subject of science and religion. Then my friend Jonathan M.S. Pierce was hey, you want to write a book? And I'm will you give me money? More seriously, I had been wanting to write a book. I had written a draft years before, but I pared something down. I got something much more sleek and down to the point and say, here are the theories. Here's why they don't work. Here's what the Bible actually says. It's clearly supernatural. Guys, it didn't happen, and we can show it didn't happen. Even if you think miracles are possible, I actually show also historical reasons why this story does not make sense. Even if you accept that God does as many miracles as you want him to, it still wouldn't line up with what we know about the nature of the Persian Magi or Roman Persian interactions, or the very character of Herod the Great himself. Nothing in the story would add up just from a historical point of view, even if, there are literally ghosts in the machine to make things happen. And also, if you have no problem with literally this magic star that can float over and point out a particular hovel in a small town. So I finally write this book in, 2013. was able to get some attention with that along with my other journal article, and I was even able to go to a major conference at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands to have this other big panel with other scholars of history, biblical studies, astronomy, discussing this. I was the third person to go up and give a talk that day, and I laid out very quickly, here are the various theories, here's why they don't work, and here's why this whole effort is bumpkiss. And I sat down the person next to me, and this is still like, the first day of our 3-day conference. Person sitting next to me says, "I think we're done now." That was the attitude that most of these guys had, is like, we already figured out this ain't history a long time ago. So, Adair up there, you already figured out the problem for us. Let's do something else. There are still lots of really good contributions that are really interesting there about like the history of astrology. In particular, one of the experts on the Antikythera mechanism was up there and gave a separate talk related to that ancient computer that could do astronomical calculations. That's another awesome topic all in itself that he was able to discuss, and that's the real exciting stuff. So nonetheless, I write this book. I convince some people, at least, that I'm doing a good job making the arguments in my approach to the Greek and what it actually says. One of the people who attended the conference as well, Annette Mertz, who literally wrote the book The Historical Jesus with Gerd Thiessen. So it's literally called The Historical Jesus. So when you write The Historical Jesus, that book should be treated somewhat seriously, right? She actually cited my translation of the Gospel of Matthew and my points on the Greek to justify her skepticism of the story as well. So I'm like, okay, I've got actual Bible scholars looking at me and saying I didn't completely flub the grammar. That made me feel real, real good. So I'm still working in trying to convince others to not promote these sorts of things at the planetarium, or to convince other Bible scholars we should all get on board with my ideas, and also trying to explore maybe there are other literary avenues to explain it. So while I tried explaining it primarily with reference to the star prophecy from the Book of Numbers and the story of a guiding star for Aeneas fleeing Troy, I think there might be some other interesting background to that I want to explore and publish on. I'm planning on going to SBL in just a couple months. That is on a tangential point that's related to this, but it's mostly with the story from Revelation and how it has a star in there and its title. And if I can explain that there and convince the Bible scholars I'm not completely full of it, it'll be a premise for the larger argument I want to make about the even more mythical origins of this story.
I really want to hear more on that for sure. And I hope people will go get the book, because all of it's there. It's in the book, and they can see what your arguments are and your points being made about the other arguments and things like that. As far as Jesus goes, I want to hear your take. I study and research scholars. Now, I know you're not a New Testament scholar. It's not like this is your specialty, but you have an interest in this. So to you, what do you make of the Jesus story? And was there a guy, or do you think he was completely made up? Where are you at with this?
So I find myself most convinced by the case that's given by Richard Carrier for mythicism being more likely than not. And similarly to Richard's case, it is not at all irrational to come to the conclusion there was a guy and that he did things that then other stories were glommed onto. It's basically, to me, more of a paradigm question, and which of them can fit the evidence best with the fewest number of added on assumptions or points of contention. So when somebody says, well, there of course was a historical Jesus, that's the guy who got killed and then all these other stories were added to, that's a totally reasonable thing. It's where the vast majority of biblical studies is. And I would not tell someone, well, I say otherwise, therefore you should believe me. Mm-hmm. I think, though, there are like a whole bunch of points of argumentation that should move the Academy towards more skepticism of the historical Jesus, or at the very least, more reason that we should be skeptical we can say anything about him. So it could be the case there wasn't a historical Jesus, and some of the kernels of his story are in the gospel accounts, but I don't think there's any tools that we actually have that can actually extract out those kernels to actually show this is really what happened versus what was later added on, because it seems like everything that is told in the gospel stories is told on purpose. They're not accidentally bringing in details that they didn't intend to let you know that actually happened, which is often like part of like the criterion of embarrassment or things like that. They're saying this thing, it's embarrassing, but they just have to tell you about it because there's no other way around it. My thought process, no, these are religious tracts. They are telling you exactly what they want you to hear. So why are they telling you this story? even if someone else might find it embarrassing. The idea that Jesus had to be baptized by John the Baptist and saying, well, this is an embarrassing thing, so that's why Matthew and Luke have to, change things, or John just completely drops it. But if you go to Mark, is there any sign of embarrassment? No. He seems like this is, fulfilling, the greater purpose of things. And of course, you could imagine why Mark would create such a story. It now literally has the Baptist christening Jesus as the one to come. That's what John is supposed to be doing. He's supposed to be the voice crying in the wilderness for, to make the way straight for the coming Messiah. And if the story is then setting up and saying, and Jesus is that person, well, that's the reason to make the story up. So we seem to lack the tools or sources to really get behind the Gospels in the way that I wish we could. Now, it's not the case that we don't know what Jesus did, therefore he doesn't exist. That would be fallacious. So, for example, I think I very well prove that the Star of Bethlehem story, the entire birth narratives are complete historical nonsense. Just because they're historical nonsense doesn't mean Jesus wasn't born. Because someone writes a story about a fictional birth doesn't mean the person is not born. If I wrote a fantastical story about your birth, that doesn't make you not exist all of a sudden. It just makes me a crappy historian. Mm-hmm. So it's then a question of paradigms and where do we go from there? And so what can explain the origins of Christianity and its development? And one thought I've been having somewhat recently that I think goes a little bit beyond where Carrier was discussing things. He was nudging this, but I don't think fully addressed it. And it's a way that points me even more to saying there's a general weirdness with the general idea of the most generic version of the historical Jesus. So I think the absolute most generic version of a historical Jesus is guy who gets himself in some sort of hot water that gets him killed, and specifically crucified, because that's what we find in the earliest creed and hymnal statements. So let's take that as the bare minimum historical Jesus. So no parables, no miracle stories, no special teachings, no apocalypse now stories or anything like that. Just dude did something that got him in trouble with the authorities, that got him killed. So let us assume that. Along with also, he had a following. That also needs to be the case because we have all these people who say they are followers of Christ. Whether it be the disciples in the traditional sense of being like the 12 apostles, or just other guys who hang around him and then take on his message. So, and basically then treat him as, the Christ in some form or another, and especially as you see in Paul. Let's just, again, say the absolute bare minimum Jesus. Dude gets himself in trouble, and his followers carry on after he's executed by crucifixion. So I want us to imagine it's 33 AD, let's say June. So this is after the time Jesus is supposed to be crucified according to our stories. And the Christians are beginning to preach their message of Jesus resurrected or Jesus coming back. What are the authorities in Jerusalem going to do? Because remember, they've already put Jesus to death for being this sort of rabble-rouser. If his followers are still going around and saying, we're going to continue the rabble, why aren't they being put down by the same authorities that went after Jesus? And instead, they are able to continue this church in Jerusalem for decades and evangelize beyond it. So we see this from the letters of Paul. We don't have to trust Acts or anything else like that. Just from the letters of Paul, we can see that there is a Jerusalem church that he visits, that it's stable because it lasts for literally decades. He talks about, first converting to Christianity, then coming and visiting the disciple, or visiting some people 3 years later, and then coming back another 14 years later. So we got almost 20 years of church history at minimum in Jerusalem. And it basically only ends with the Jerusalem War. And so I stop and say, how is it that this group is continuing to preach that they find great solace in the message of this person that either the Jewish or Roman authorities said, we need to put this guy to death. And these guys are saying, no, he is absolutely wonderful and we still follow him. Why aren't they being harangued and thrown out of Jerusalem with at least significant force, if not deadly force? It's things like that that make me say, okay, that historical version of Jesus, that bare minimum one, has trouble explaining itself how it gets off the ground and actually forms a church, let alone one that spreads throughout the Roman Empire. On the other hand, if I then try to compare that with the mythical approach and the idea that they're not preaching a man crucified by Roman authorities, but some sort of angelic being who is killed in another dimension of sorts, or in the higher realms, as in particular the way Richard Carrier puts it, that doesn't have the same baggage, because if Peter's going around and preaching Christ crucified by demonic forces rather than Roman authorities, why would the Romans care? If he's going around and claiming, we worship the guy that the Romans said needs to be put to death, it seems like then the Romans are going to come in and say, hey, no more of this, that's rabble-rousing, and we do not approve of that sort of thing. So if things like that, along with the general case that Carrier makes, it seems like we can explain the origins of Christianity. But, mind you, I am just saying, here's what doesn't necessarily make sense to me. Do we have any rock-solid evidence one way or the other? Absolutely not. It could be the case that we dig up some scroll from 40 CE that describes Jesus as an itinerant philosopher. Boom, mythicism is dead, happy to throw it away. On the other hand, maybe we find another letter of Paul and he explains another letter to the Galatians and say, you foolish Galatians, do I have to explain this again? Jesus clearly was never on earth and he was always just in the sky. It's only he's coming to earth after he takes down Satan. If we find that letter, well, mythicism is now just, through the roof, extremely likely. But we don't have that evidence. We must say it's ambiguous and arguable, and that's as far as I'm willing to go. I will not be dogmatic about this. I will only be dogmatically arguing we should have the argument.
Thank you.